Okay, welcome, Paula.
Lovely to be with you.
Would you just introduce yourself for us?
Yes, so I'm Paula, and I'm a lay minister in the Church of England. I have the very unusual job for a lay minister in the Church of England of being a residentiary canon of a cathedral. There's only one of us doing it, which is me. And I'm canon chancellor of St. Paul's Cathedral, which means that I look after the learning and theology that takes place within St. Paul's Cathedral, which is a wonderful and insane job all rolled into one. My background is that I'm a New Testament scholar, and I trained as a Paul expert, so my real speciality is 2 Corinthians. But because when you get to teaching, you expand outwards. So my very first job was in Old Testament. So I taught for 6 to 7 years in Old Testament. Then I taught New Testament. So pretty much I can range over most of the Bible now. And I must say that the one thing that I have learned over 25 years of teaching the Bible is I think I understand it less than I did when I started 25 years ago. And that's really great. I've got more questions now than I ever did. And for me, what happens is the more you learn, the more questions you have. And I just think I probably have slightly better questions than I did when I started. But other than that, it's all questions and a few answers, but not very many.
Great. So let's start off with a couple of these questions from the chat. Sharon, I wonder if you might just ask your question out loud.
Hi, Paula. I loved what you had to say. And I've got quite a few friends from the sort of honour, shame culture. And I just find that my natural interpretation and their natural interpretation is very different. So I think in the Western world, you're absolutely right. We put great store on what people do and integrity and how they behave when they're not being seen. But in honour, shame cultures, actually, what you say is really important. And actually, you are causing shame, but that is part of the honouring of somebody, as you said. And I'm just wondering whether somebody from an honour shame culture would actually interpret it the same way that you did, or whether deep down actually it does matter what you do over what you say, or whether for them actually they would still put way more importance on the honour of the saying.
So that's a really, really interesting question. And the challenge, of course, is that I have no idea, because I'm not from an honour shame culture and therefore would find it very hard to answer from that perspective. But I think what Jesus is doing in so many of the parables, once you have honour shame in your head as a category, think about the parables, and so many of them are about challenging honour and shame in different ways. The prodigal son's another one, which is a real kind of, it goes for the whole honour shame culture. And so I suspect, though cannot know for certain because I'm not, as I've said already, that actually what Jesus is doing is really shining a spotlight on the things that go wrong in an honour shame culture. And I think where I've got to with my wonderings about it is, while we don't have a formal honour shame culture, we actually have a really strong informal honour shame culture. And I kind of tried to imagine, if Jesus were telling a parable like the parable of the 2 sons to us, challenging the way in which we do honour and shame, what would it look like? What would it have in it? And for me, it's a fascinating question. Where would Jesus challenge us in those kind of ways? So, to sum up, I don't know, but I do think that Jesus is really challenging honour shame in all sorts of different ways all the way through his parables. But I think he'd also have something really powerful to say to us. I'd be fascinated if anyone felt like writing a modern day parable of Jesus challenging honour shame in social media or something, because I think honour shame kind of is the underpinning of a lot of exchanges in social media.
That kind of flows on to the question that Faith put in the chat, which again, would you ask that out loud, Faith?
Yeah, sure. So I was struck by when you were talking about when people are communicating online, the stressing of words over actions. And something that I see over and over online is when there's a disagreement, someone will point someone to a link and sometimes very snarkily say, like, educate yourself. And I kind of have an intuition that the interest is getting that person to verbally agree with a position and like win an argument rather than really engage in the hard work of relationship toward actual transformation. And I wanted to know your thoughts on that.
I think my thoughts are not very profound in that. I absolutely agree. And yeah, absolutely. And I think one of the things that is really interesting to observe on social media is actually, again, what often happens is that it is about words and winning points and looking good, rather than actually being transformed, as you said, forming a relationship, being a different person because you've shaped a relationship with somebody. And a lot of the exchanges, I totally love social media. I'm a real Twitter addict. And one of the things I really love about it is that you can have deeply transformative relationships going on in Twitter in a countercultural kind of way. And in this last week, kind of various things that have happened, I've forged relationships with people I would never normally engage with because of the way in which it works. So it can be a really, really good thing, but it can also be a really, really negative thing. And it is, and it's back to that kind of the point that Sharon was making around the words over actions. Maybe it's kind of one of those things to think about as we're kind of working, as we engage on social media, is, am I just saying this so that and then whatever, look good, get more followers, win a point, there's all sorts of reasons why I might just be saying this. Or actually, does this reveal deep integrity? And it's that kind of deep, profound integrity stuff, which I think is interesting, and what Jesus has got his eye on in this parable.
That's great.
Thank you.
There's a few questions here, as Joe alluded to before, about the gnashing of teeth. It keeps reoccurring in our readings of the parables. And then David's asked something too about the violent images of God. I wonder if you could speak into that.
Yeah, I'll just pull up the chat so I can see.
Yeah, I can read his question to you. So how can we interpret the more violent images of God in the parables? For example, in liberation theology interpretation, we saw the parables of the talents in a more ironic way. Some think we can say how much more God will be like this, more rewarding, etc. But could it be that Jesus is being sarcastic?
Always. In answer to that final question, I think the thing that we often miss we just don't get Jesus's tone of voice ever. And I was talking once to a comedian who said what a shame it was that Jesus wasn't more funny. And I wanted to, well, I didn't just want to say, I did actually say, I think Jesus is hysterical, but you have to read it with the right tone of voice behind what he says. I think Jesus cracks jokes all over the place, but you have to be alert to it. So Jesus is always, if you think, I wonder if Jesus is being ironic here, I would suggest the answer normally is yes. He is poking fun, turning things upside down, shaking them a little bit, and making them different, getting us to look at things slantwise. That's what the parables are all about. And in a way, that's where I kind of want to get into what Jesus is doing in the parables. I think we absolutely ruin the parables by trying to make Jesus do one single thing all the time, going in a certain direction. That question that we regularly want to ask about the parables, yes, but what does it mean, is for me the absolutely wrong question you should ever ask about the parables. What I think the parables are about is, what does it make me think differently? How do I see the world in a different kind of way once I've seen the parables? I don't think personally, and you're very, very welcome to disagree with me, but I don't think parables ever have a single meaning. I think what they do is they're playful. They give us different ways of viewing the world, which gets me into the other bit, and we'll come on to gnashing of teeth later on. But the other bit is, the bit I would really like to challenge you to think about is, are you sure that God is in all the parables? And if God is not in all the parables, is God actually in any of the parables? And what I mean by that is, what we do is we go to the parables with this little pattern that goes, one of these characters is God and one of these characters is me. and I've got to work out which one is God and which one is me. And one of the things I became absolutely convinced about when I was reading the parables is definitely God is not in all of them. And it might be that God is not in any of them. That's my really controversial statement of the day. But definitely, I don't think God is in all of them. Shall I just, Joe, I'm not forgetting gnashing, and you won't let me forget gnashing. But I'd kind of like to, I think this is a safe place to raise a question that upsets a whole load of people, but I think you probably will be interested in me exploring it. Here we go. I don't think God is in the prodigal of the parable son. The prodigal, yeah, I said that right, in the parable of the prodigal son. I don't think God's in there. And I'll tell you why. And once if you grab that, then you get into some really, really interesting territory. So you all know the traditional interpretation of the prodigal son, which is God is the father. We are the prodigal son. God is the one who rescues us when we need the rescue. Now, or we might just be the older son who doesn't go off and stays, but we're probably the prodigal son. And those nasty people over there, they're the older son. You know, it's not us, it's them over there. But what if actually this is a different kind of a story? And the reason why I would argue, sorry, I've just seen Joe's comment come up. The reason why I would argue that God isn't in the prodigal son is that actually the father is a really bad father, really, really bad father, for various reasons. One of them is because all the advice in Judaism at the time of Jesus said that the one thing you must never do as a father is split your inheritance before you die. And the reason why you mustn't split your inheritance before you die is that it will cause absolute dysfunction in your family. So the person for whom you have split your inheritance will probably go off and spend it all. And the ones who haven't gone off and spent it all will resent the other ones. You'll cause an absolute division in your family and you will end up with a completely dysfunctional family. The rabbinic texts mention it 3 or 4 different times. So what's really interesting is in the prodigal son, the younger son comes and says, split your inheritance. And the father just goes, okay, doesn't engage with the wisdom of the time. And actually, in a way, the prodigal son is a walking, talking example of why you shouldn't split your inheritance before you die, because the younger son goes off and spends it all and the older son is alienated. But there's a bigger problem, which is that if you split your inheritance before you die, what you do is that you apportion it outwards, which means that therefore it's no longer yours. You've given it to the other son. So the younger son has his, and what's left from what the younger son had belongs to the older son. So you're at the end of the parable when the younger son comes back and the father says, oh, we'll have a great feast. We'll have this great party to celebrate. He does that with the property of the older son. It's no longer his property, it's the older son's property now. And not only does he throw a party with the older son's property, he doesn't even invite the older son to the party. He only found out that the party was going on because he heard it in the fields and went, what on earth is going on? So it kind of challenges a really quite kind of, I find it very hard, shall we say, to say that God is the father, because actually that's not the action of a good father. The good father, the father is unwise, is uncaring, and doesn't in fact reach out to the older son. So instead, I would say that what the prodigal son is all about is if a dysfunctional, thoughtless father can behave like this to his younger son, how much more will God behave like that to us? So God actually isn't in the parable. It gets us to reflect on what God is like, and therefore, would God do this? Is this the kind of action that God would have? If you start pulling on that thread, if God isn't in the prodigal son, then where else is God? In the parables. And I would say that a lot of the parables are, think about this everyday existence, you know, son's going out to work in the vineyard, a woman's lost a coin and can't find it. You've got all sorts of different examples of everyday life. Have a think about this, and then think about what you think God would do in response. So it kind of changes it all around, and throws the parables up in the air in a really interesting way, I think. I still haven't got to gnashing yet, but we will.
I think that's really helpful. Like we've been last week I spoke about the parable of the tenants, and it's like the talents, sorry, and it's similar, isn't it? So if you think that the property owner is God, then he's really a dishonest, shifty businessman who's asking people to break Jewish law by, trying to charge interest on things. So like, I think we've been looking a lot to the Amy Jill Levine kind of readings of the parables, setting them in Jewish context. And she said really similar to what you've been saying. I've been kind of keep going back to parables are not Aesop's fables with one key message, but actually I think your point of saying, is God even necessarily in this, is even a more of a ground shaking thing to get us to think a bit differently about the parables, because it's so hard for those of us who grew up in church to not get stuck in the interpretations that we were given since we were kids. So thank you for that. It's really helpful.
Add an extra little thing on the back of it, which is a really important thing. Reading the parables is advanced level Bible reading, way, way beyond. If you might think it's the way in, but it is advanced level Bible reading, because what you do when you learn how to read the Bible is you go, well, the first thing you do is you work out what kind of genre it is, what kind of literature it is. If it's law, you read it like it's law. If it's poetry, you read it like it's poetry. If it's history, you read it like it's history. And then you get to the parables. And basically what happens with the parables is you have to read every single one of them differently. You can't just go, this is a parable, I read it like this. Because there are some parables where you can go, because Jesus does it, parable of the sower, this is that, and that is that, and that is that. Where you can draw lines out from the parable, and each one means a different thing. But then you have other parables where actually you can't draw lines out because you're not quite sure who they go out to. And then there are some parables where one line goes out, but there aren't any other lines that go out. So each parable you've got to read differently in the light of the rules it gives you. And that's why parable reading is a really complicated thing to do.
Well, maybe we should go to the gnashing of teeth question, because that is something that it's in quite a number of the parables, isn't it? Yes. And almost now when I see it coming up, I'm like, oh, Joe's not going to like this one. No, I'm just kidding. No. Paula, what do you think about the gnashing of teeth?
Well, bear in mind that it's mostly Matthew's parables. So again, what you've got to do is you've got to say that it's not all parables, it's mostly Matthew. I have to confess a confession, which is that of all the four Gospels, I love 3 of them and not so much the other one. And I'll give you a wild stab in the dark, which is the one I don't like very much. Matthew, I find, is a very straight line kind of a gospel. He's very combative. He likes to exclude people all over the place. It's the gospel I struggle with more than any of the other gospels. So just note that Matthew loves his gnashing more than the other gospel writers do. But the really interesting thing to notice is that while the language about the gnashing of teeth is really complex, notice that actually we're not talking hell. There's no reference to the word hell anywhere. So we import the word hell in, and we like to do it. And the way we go is that Jesus talks about Gehenna in his when he talks about it, and the word Gehenna gets translated as hell, and the word Gehenna is the place, possibly, though there is a problem with this, but possibly which was a rubbish dump outside of Jerusalem. But there is a problem with that. Anyway, we'll leave that for the moment. But it was a place where fires happened. So when you see fire, you then go, fire, Gehenna. Gehenna means hell. Footnote, it doesn't. And therefore, whenever you see the word fire, you import hell into it. So let's just be very clear that actually when Jesus is talking about gnashing of teeth, he's not talking about hell, but he is talking about the experience of judgment. But what's very, very interesting about the way in which the gnashing of teeth builds up, and I haven't got the time to do it in detail for you, but I will just tell you, and you might be able to see it as you read your way through, is that gnashing of teeth occurs, and particularly you find it in the Old Testament, when people realize something about themselves and about the world that they then regret. So it's not necessarily a punishment, it's about the recognition that there was something that you realized that you knew all along and you haven't paid any attention to, and now you regret it. If you kind of trace the word gnashing through the Old Testament, people always gnash their teeth when at a moment of regret, when they've realized they've made a really big mistake. And I think what is going on when Jesus is talking about the people where there is weeping and gnashing of teeth is it's not, sorry, every time I don't see anyone else's chats, I just see Joe's chat come up. Joe says it's like her in therapy. And I think one of the thing that is really very striking is that kind of gnashing of teeth is that moment of deep recognition when you suddenly realize how the world is. And if you have a look at the parables, what Jesus is doing time and time again is talking about those occasions when people suddenly realize how the world is and actually now what they regret about how they've lived in the world. So it's not a punishment. It's a kind of a way of self-recognition, that ability to kind of understand the world as it is. First thing I would say. The second thing I would say is that one of the really striking things is that Jesus, we are not the people who decide who's going out there to do the gnashing of the teeth. The really significant thing is that this happens at a moment of judgment, that moment when the decision is made. So when at that moment when people at the end of time understand the world as it really is, and it's the angels who come in to do it. I think one of the really striking thing is to notice that actually whenever they're talking about the gnashing of teeth, they're talking about what happens then, far off into the future. And really importantly, Jesus says, don't pull up the weeds from the wheat now, because actually you won't know till then. The really important thing being, don't you do it. You don't get to choose who gnashes their teeth. And if there were only one thing that Christians should learn over more than any others, is that we're not the ones who get to choose who gnashes their teeth and who doesn't gnash their teeth. Actually, it is to do with the angels at the end of time, when really people begin to see the world as it is and to recognize where they are in the world. So I would understand this as self-gnashing, if you see what I mean. It's not that we decide, we sit here and go, them, we choose them for going outside and gnashing their teeth. Actually, it is when at the end of all times and the judgment comes and you look and you suddenly realize that actually you self-identified yourself as a gnasher earlier on, if that makes any sense.
That makes total sense. Joe, did you have something you wanted to say on the back of that?
Yeah, just like that's kind of sort of what I hoped, like someone who actually is a scholar, someone who's studying this stuff would say. But what you've just said about the end, I hadn't considered about the end of all time thing. And that I'm really encouraged because that really fits with what my view of judgment is. Like what I think happens when we die, what I think that what the Bible says is heaven and hell is. And for me, I guess with my particular history, it's how I manage to not spend my whole time wanting terrible things to happen to people who've done terrible things to me. And so what I view judgment as is basically the absolute naked, unblinkered truth. And that for some of us who've had to face that already, including the bits that aren't very nice, that's going to be less of a hellish experience. Yeah. It doesn't mean we're going to just get the pat on the head and there won't still be things that we need to face, but it's going to be a lot less terrible than for, say, someone who was blinkered and deluded and lying to themselves and others so much that they could do a terrible thing to a small person or a whole group of people. That when their blinkers come off, that's going to be pretty hideous. And this isn't about me blowing my own trumpet, but I'm quite glad that I've done some of that, facing some of the big stuff already. I'm not saying there won't still be like some unpleasant surprises, but at least I've done the process.
And I wonder actually whether, in a way, what Jesus is talking about is that we'll all do a bit of gnashing of teeth. You know, there's not just the happy ones will do none, but those will all do some kind of gnashing. But the other thing to bear in mind is when we hear the word judgment, we always imagine it's God going, and you've been really, really awful. But actually, what if God says, great, fabulous job. When you did that, that was a really good thing that you did. You need to do a bit of gnashing over here and be really pleased with yourself over there. I mean, judgment is about that recognition of good and evil, not just of evil. Yeah, judgment as truth, not as punishment, absolutely.
Well, that's fascinating. And thanks, Joe, for being so just open as you are about these things. It's really, really helpful.
Just, can I add a thing?
Mm-hmm.
It's a sentence, but the other thing is with the process, when that's happened in therapy, the thing is that your therapist, so in this case, I am equating that person with God. My therapist has held me in what they call unconditional positive regard, no matter where I am in that process. So if I hate everybody, or if I've just had a massive light bulb moment, all of that, they are the ones that hold firm, and they are the ones that continue to, I would say, love you unconditionally, whatever's going on.
Beautiful.
Yeah.
So there's a bunch of questions in the chat, but I think just thematically, Faith, do you want to just go back to what you've just posted there, and then we can go on to some of the questions about community?
Yeah, so I just posted, would you say then that the way you're talking about gnashing of teeth makes me think of repentance? So is in the sense you're talking about it, is repentance sort of equivalent to teeth gnashing then? Meaning you change your mind when you realize that you've done something wrong, and that's the teeth gnashing.
I think there's an element of it. And the other interesting thing I would chuck in is that within Judaism, particularly kind of texts from around the 2nd century, they equate fire with catharsis, with kind of you burn off the bad stuff so that the good stuff remains. And so we often kind of think of fire as just punishment, whereas they see it as a means of purifying so that the good stuff comes through. And if you know 1 Peter, you'll know that 1 Peter talks about fire in exactly that way. And so therefore, again, I think probably we've not only got the wrong end of the stick, but picked up the wrong stick entirely when we're thinking about what we have traditionally called hell, because I think it doesn't mean what we have assumed it has meant.
Yeah, sorry, one last question. When you said that, it really makes me think of Jesus's quote about being salted with fire. And now I'm done.
Yes, absolutely.
Very good. Can we go to Naomi? You had a question about the individual versus the communal. Maybe you could ask that one.
Can't find it now.
Sorry, surprising you.
Oh yeah, here we go, I've got it. Yeah, something that we've kind of touched on before and I think is important to us, like as a group, is the idea that, you know, a lot of times we'll come to this and read parables or sections of text, and like you say, like we're trying to place ourselves as an individual, or we're trying to get an individual meaning, something that it means for us on how we as an individual live our lives. Whereas something that I've heard of, and I don't, you know, again, I can't exactly point this to a specific thing, but I've heard people saying that actually Jesus is speaking to, this is what this means for your community. Like the idea of you being just an individual wasn't really a thing back then, like you belonged to a group. So I'm wondering if that changes the way that we approach some of the parables.
Absolutely. You know, it's the most important thing to get your head around when you're trying to read any of the New Testament, let alone just the parables, is the biggest problem we've got in the English language is the word you can mean you on your own, and it can mean you altogether. And if I go to Paul, the bit that I know best is that 80% of the time when Paul uses the word you, he means you altogether, not you on your own. And I think absolutely the world of Jesus was a corporate world. There was no such thing as me on my own. I don't know if you know the Ubuntu theology quote, but I absolutely love it because it helps you understand it. I mean, it's kind of phrased in all sorts of different ways, but I am because I belong, or I am because we are, those kind of ideas. And that's the world of the New Testament. And we very much do that. Yes, but what did Jesus say about me? And the answer is probably not very much, actually. It's all about the community and how you inhabit the community. So yeah, spot on. And that's really significant. The two where it doesn't quite work in the same kind of way are the two parables about families, where it's slightly different, but the rest, absolutely.
Probably could talk about that all day. Lorraine, you had a question earlier that was interesting about how God learns changes. Did you want to ask that?
So I'll let Stephen ask it.
Okay.
It was just something I was thinking about what you were saying, Paula, about the father in the parable of the prodigal son. And one of the things that strikes me about the entire biblical narrative is that it shows God constantly goes against his better judgment where the human race is concerned. We as a species constantly challenge him to go against his better judgment, kind of like the father in that parable.
Yeah, absolutely. And again, I would absolutely agree with you. If there's one thing we know about God, is that God is willing to change and change and change. You know, that lovely passage with Abraham, where he goes, if I can find 50, will you let us off? God said, yes, yes, yes. If I can find 20, yes, yes, yes. If I can find one, absolutely. So that kind of God's willing, absolute love for us all and willingness to change under any circumstances. Absolutely agree with that. The bit where I would just push back on the father and the prodigal son is that he just behaves so badly to the elder son. If you didn't have the elder son bit, then you could persuade me that actually God and the younger son, it fits in so many ways. And you will probably be aware of that whole tradition about if you read Henri Nouwen's stuff around the prodigal son and how God is so overwhelmingly welcoming and loving. It's just, it's a beautiful theme. And I don't for a moment want to undermine that beautiful theme. I would just find it elsewhere in the biblical tradition. I wouldn't find it in the prodigal son, because God is just so horrible to the older. If that is God, God is horrible to the older son. And that makes no sense for me of who we understand God to be.
I was thinking how it feels like a lot of us as adults are having to like relearn these parables, and there's can be quite a lot of damage done by these oversimplification and making them children's stories. And I just wonder, I mean, obviously we can't change the world in one fell swoop, but if there's something that we can, how do we change the narrative in the church about how we relate to these so that we're not having to unteach ourselves?
Yeah, how? When you've worked it out, let me know. That would be absolutely fabulous. Because I think one of the things that we really struggle with is, I think my rule of thumb when you come to the Bible is if you read a passage and you go, I know what this passage is about, you probably don't. Because we have layers upon layers upon layers of how you read stuff and how somebody's told you you ought to read it, and therefore what the right answer is for reading it, and therefore how you've got to react to it in the way that you do. And the thing I love about the Bible more than anything else is it surprises me. You know, as I was talking about learning things over 25 years, if you can allow yourself to be surprised by the Bible, you will every single time. And for me, that kind of learning new stuff, and actually that this passage that I've always thought meant this actually maybe means that as well. Not that it doesn't mean that, but it can mean that as well. The reason I think it is a text like no other sacred scripture is that it takes me to places. And every time I look at a passage, even one that I know really, really well, if I can approach it with the right kind of attitude, I can see something in it I've never seen before that takes me somewhere else. And that for me is really amazing. But how we unlearn, I don't know.
I think, you know, Pete Enns and his, like the sin of certainty, this idea of seeking wisdom, not certainty, has been really important to lots of us at IGB. And I guess as a mom, I've got a 4-year-old and an almost 15-year-old, thinking about how you teach and help kids to actually ask questions and to empower those questions rather than teach things as black and white like I learned them. It's a challenge, and then it's a challenge how to do that when so many of the resources that are out there are not doing that. So
I think it's probably also important to say that actually sometimes it's okay too, because sometimes we're just too tired. You know, sometimes I go, oh, I've got no more brain space for a new idea. And actually the old stuff is all right too. You know, again, the swing of the pendulum, we don't want to swing too far and go, you have to think a new thought every single time, because that becomes its own tyranny too. But it's about kind of just being who you are and allowing the Bible to speak to you as you are, however that is. I have been having a little rant on social media though this week about how unhelpful translations are.
Amen.
I was reading, I do morning prayer every morning, and we were blessed with Hosea. And after a whole week of whores, I broke down and started a little rant because it's such a horrible, horrible, horrible translation, offensive in so many, many ways. And I think we also need to be really careful about how the translations we read the Bible in, because there's such a lot of offensive language in there, because which has come through from Christian history.
Yeah, absolutely. That's so true. And we do keep trying to go back to this, like, contextualization, trying to understand what was going on at the time, looking at the layers of even what the translator brings to their reading of the text, and how many lenses we go through really when we relate to it. So that's encouraging that we're kind of going down the right route. It's tricky though when you don't speak Greek.
Yes.
I'm glad that some people do. Can I open this up to some further questions from folks that maybe have something burning? Josie.
Yeah, hi Paula. I just asked the question, when there are these persuasive examples of God changing his mind, as we've been talking about, why do we think that theologically speaking, it's so important that we understand God to be unchanging? You know, it just seems to be the sine qua non. God is unchanging, as though that is just an essential facet of us thinking about God in her perfection.
Well, this is where I play that I'm just a biblical scholar card, and I'm not a theologian, I'm a biblical scholar. And therefore I don't subscribe to the God doesn't change, because I see no evidence in the Bible that God doesn't change.
Right. Okay.
None whatsoever. You know, I can give you lots and lots of examples of the ways in which God does change, but not very, very few of God not changing. The idea of God being unchanging comes from post-biblical philosophical theology, and therefore it emerges out of a particular Greek philosophical understanding of what is perfect, and something that is perfect is something that never changes.
Yeah.
And therefore I go, not for me, thank you very much, because that's not the God I encounter in the Bible.
Yeah, I agree. Thank you.
I guess it's that certainty thing. You know, wanting to point people towards something that's rock solid rather than. There's a good question here from Trevor that it would be good to kind of take a step back and look at, because he's asking, how do you know what a good translation is? And I wonder, for those of us who don't speak Greek and Hebrew, how do we really look at the Bible in its fullness?
Love that question. So if I explain something about the philosophy that lies behind translations, it helps you to understand what's going on. So there's lots of different ways of translating, but there are two key ways. There's something known as formal equivalence, which is the idea that you translate something word by word. So you take that word, you work out what it means in English, and you put it into its English words, and you do it word by word by word. That's formal equivalence. So if you ever see a Bible claiming to be accurate, they mean they're a formal equivalence translation, because they've done it word by word. The other way of doing a translation is dynamic equivalence, which means that what you do is you translate the idea rather than the word. So rather than saying, what does this precise word mean? You go, what is the idea that lies behind this? And you translate it into English according to the idea rather than according to the word. And dynamic equivalence is one that is associated with a lot of the translations that, interestingly, are easier to read, because what they're trying to do is translate the meaning more than they are trying to translate the word. And one of the things that I would always advise you to do is read the Bible in more than one translation. And at the very, very least, what I would advise you to do is have a formal equivalence translation, because it helps you have a look at what the word for word does actually mean. And then also have a dynamic equivalence, because it helps you have a look at kind of the sense meaning. So examples of a formal equivalence translation would be the New American Standard Version, the Amplified Version, the King James Version, those kind of really strict according to the text. There's one you will notice that I'm not mentioning that lots of people will hold up as the most accurate translation, which is the English Standard Version. I have a deep and abiding loathing for the English Standard Version, and therefore would never recommend anyone to read it. And the reason why is because the English Standard Version states in its introduction that they deliberately decided to exclusivize the language. So they didn't like the NRSV because it was inclusive language, and they went back to it being an exclusive language version, and they deliberately made that choice to go back to an exclusive language translation. And out of 168 people who were either key translators or advisors or checkers, you will find out of 168 people, there were 2 women, neither of whom had doctorates in New Testament. And therefore, I will not touch it with a barge pole under any circumstances. Here ends my rant. But that's why I absolutely hate the ESV. I think it is done on the wrong principles and enacted in the wrong kind of way. So don't touch that, touch all the others. And then for a dynamic equivalent translation, you're looking at something like the Good News Bible, the Living Bible, the Message, the CEV, Common English Version, those kinds of translations, which are very much more kind of sense-wise. And then you probably need something in the middle as well. And what's interesting, and I don't know how you feel about this translation, but the translation that overtly and deliberately sits in the middle between formal and dynamic equivalence is the NIV. It deliberately made the decision to go between the two. And I know that some people like the NIV, some people hate the NIV, but it's that kind of a translation that sits between. I would also recommend that you try and not have all your translations from the same family. And you can tell that a translation comes from a family because of its name. So the Standard Version is a family. So basically what's happened is that what they did is they started with King James Version, and then they developed a way of reading. And so there are certain things that they will always do the same. And the reason why I find the NRSV difficult, although it's a good translation, is that it relies on the Revised Standard Version translation and the Revised translation. It kind of goes back, and the New American Standard, they all come from the same family. So they make the same decisions over certain things, like when you come across the word infidelity in Hebrew, you translate it as whore and not as infidelity, that kind of thing. You kind of make decisions around that. So I would recommend go wide, choose a big variety of translations, and go for a formal equivalent and a dynamic equivalent, and then also the ones you like rather than the ones you don't like.
That is really, really helpful advice. It made me think, kind of connecting with something that you said before, and we've been kind of wrestling a little bit with this as a community. Lots of us are on this kind of deconstruction faith journey. A number of us have studied theology and like really enjoy that deep digging in, but how we get the balance sometimes between what is like a devotional reading of the Bible and worship, and how we get those moments of like feeling God's reassurance for us versus how we do the kind of deeper level of study. I guess that's kind of a movable feast, how we do that. So I'm just curious how you, as someone who studies the Bible for a living, how do you do the kind of worship side of things and relating to God's words? And, yeah.
Well, there's always a bit of a curse, I think, when you become a professional at something that's important to you, which is that you can never take that part of you away again. And I always say that one of the things that is really hard about becoming a professional biblical scholar is I can't take my biblical scholar brain out. And so therefore, if I'm sitting in a church service and someone says something and I go, no, it's really difficult. I just have to kind of suck it up and be quiet. Because there are some things that some people say where you go, no, that's, I can tell you why that's wrong, and it's really, really awful. And then I have to say, but actually it is still nevertheless a really important perspective. So don't ask me is the answer. I'm no good at it. But I think the thing, so long as we don't, if we start a sentence by saying, and I'm making a very deliberate reference here, and if you've seen the video, you'll know what I'm talking about. If you feel the need to say the Bible is clear, then don't trust what comes after it, because it is absolutely untrustworthy. But if you say, I was reading the Bible and it made me feel, or I was reading the Bible and as a result, I think this about the world, then listen to it all. Because I think one of the really striking things for me is that somebody who is not trying to beat you over the head, but actually to say the Bible spoke to me about this, listen. And as you would with everything, ask yourself whether you think it's going in a healthy direction. Ask whether you think it's an important thing to say. But if someone says the Bible is clear, I then will not listen to them, because if they feel the need to beat me with it, then therefore that has to be something that is not going in the right direction. So it's important to get a balance, but I think it's very easy. And I think the thing that makes me feel very uncomfortable as a trained reader of the Bible is there's a whole lot, I've heard so many people told they're not allowed to think that. And I sit there going, I think you can think that. I don't think there's any problem with thinking that, because you get into very narrow ways of thinking. So also, if ever you feel the need to say, I mean, and I can challenge, I've just said to people, I sit here and I hear people say something that I think is wrong. Actually, we shouldn't tell anyone that it's wrong. I think what we need to ask is, what are the implications of thinking that? Where does it come from? How does it impact on people? There is, oh, let me just tell you one thing, because I think it will be helpful. The parable of the sheep and the goats, I'm pretty confident is interpreted by most Christians wrongly. And if you're interested, you can have a look at my book where I unpack it. But I'm pretty confident that actually that's not what Jesus meant when he was telling the parable of the sheep and the goats, for all sorts of reasons. But that doesn't mean that how it's interpreted is wrong, if you get my distinction. Because actually how we interpret the sheep and the goats is that I should care for people who are hungry and naked and have no home and who are in prison. Absolutely you should. And if you read all the way through the Bible, that's absolutely what the Bible says. The parable of the sheep and the goats probably doesn't mean that, but it doesn't matter, I don't think. And that's where I would say there isn't a right and a wrong. There are things that are wrong in the sense that they have a powerful impact on people's lives, and you can guess certain interpretations that I think are absolutely wrong interpretations because of their implications. I'll start, I'm jabbering, but you get the idea. I think it's quite interesting just to listen to how people are interpreting it.
That's good jabbering. I like that. So we're probably going to wrap it up in a minute because it's about 6:10 already, if you can believe it. But I just wondered if anybody has some last burning questions or comments that they'd like to make in the next 5 minutes.
It's not really parable related, but a little while ago, I was reading about King David and I'm trying to remember if it was Isaac, and there was talk about killing towns and men and women and things. And how do you find yourself reconciling with texts like that in the Old Testament?
Over the last 2 minutes, I suspect that I might need to come back again.
Sorry.
But the short version is, what I would say is that when we say the Bible is the word of God, it is, in my view, you're very welcome to disagree with me, but it is what humans thought God was saying at that time. And therefore, we are allowed to disagree. And one of the things that I think is really, really important to recognize about the Bible is that although we call it the Bible, actually its name is the books. It doesn't claim to be one thing, it claims to be lots of things. And what's really interesting about the Bible is that in the Bible, it has different opinions, and they're very happy putting different opinions next to each other. So, for example, 1 Samuel has the opinion that having a king is a really, really good idea, and having a king is an absolutely terrible idea, and it puts them both next to each other in the text, which therefore suggests that what you're meant to do is say this is a book of voices that don't always agree with each other, a book of voices that have conversations with each other. And therefore what it's doing is inviting you into the conversation to go, what do you think? How do you relate to this? So what they're talking about is really important, but there isn't a single answer to what you ought to do. And for me, what's really significant is I will sit there and go, I just, sorry, don't agree, totally don't agree. But then what you have to do is say, well, why don't you agree? What do you think about God that means that you think that this is not one of the strands of what God has said? How would you begin to kind of push things back? And I think the Bible is an invitation into a conversation, not a statement.
Great, thank you. Sorry, I threw that one at you.
That's brilliant. I love that. That's a great answer. Okay, folks. Well, maybe one more person. Does anybody else have anything they'd like to say? Julia, you had a question.
I was just curious about the picture behind you. I just keep catching sight of it and thinking, I just wonder what that is.
It is. It's a picture of Jesus sitting on Mary's knee with a whole lot of people come to visit. It's probably meant to be the Magi, and it's set somewhere in a medieval period. And someone gave it to us for our wedding. Don't ask me what it is because I don't know. They just gave it to us, and I rather like it, so I put it there. So it's the visit of the Magi, but beyond that, I can't tell you.
Brilliant. Well, thank you so much, Paula, for being with us. And we'd really love to have you back. There's so many more questions that will probably arise after we end this call. But thanks so much for your time. Maybe we could all unmute and say a big thank you before we.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Good night. We'll see you soon.
Thank you.
Bye.
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 Bye. Bye.
Bye.